So the imperial cult is something that has quite a lot of beginnings, so I'm going to pick a couple to try and take you through today. One of them might be a fairly famous event in Roman history, which is the death of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. Pretty much as soon as Caesar lies dead at the foot of Pompey's statue, fingers are being pointed. Why did he deserve to die? They've got to quite quickly justify his killing. Might be because he's quite arrogant, according to some of the other senators. He doesn't treat them terribly well. It might be because he's consolidated a little too much power in himself, rather than the traditional republican structures of collegiality. It also might be because of his claimed relationships with the gods. He claims to be the descendant of Venus, who therefore favors him above all others. He might even have accepted pure divine honors and deification during his own lifetime. And that is very much debated still today among scholars. A lot of people have been arguing for centuries, is probably not too far away, about whether or not Julius Caesar was actually worshipped in his lifetime as a god. I'm not going to try and finalize that discussion in these 15 minutes. But it raises an interesting problem that the Romans had across the Roman Empire for the next man who is going to come to power, and that's Augustus, who is Julius Caesar's adopted son and grandnephew. How is he going to somehow square the circle of not getting killed, as Julius Caesar had, not going too far and breaking republican Roman precedents, but also justifying his position as preeminent first man? And that is the title actually he went by more than the emperor that we tend to use today, princeps, first man. Understandably, he'd seen a fairly bad model, didn't want to end up the same way as Julius Caesar, so he's looking around for different ideas of how one might be able to justify oneself without falling into that particularly sticky assassination plot. But it's also important that he doesn't not just have to focus on what he's doing in Rome, but also across the wider Roman Empire, from the Latin West to the Hellenistic East, which is what I'm going to focus on predominantly today. What's going to work in one part of the empire is not necessarily going to work from the other. There is a wide range of things. And one of the things that might have helped him is the foundation of the imperial cult, or rather, again, probably in the plural, imperial cults. We're dealing with quite a lot of different structures in a lot of different places. As I say, what works in one place and indeed one time isn't necessarily the same. There are some useful precedents for him. I do come with pictures. Hellenistic precedents. Somebody who has already been mentioned forms one of those. The idea of deification, as we've already heard, is certainly not a novel idea in the 1st century BCE, when Augustus is sort of trying to figure this out. Ancient myths and religion are absolutely full of heroes who become gods. Hercules might be the most famous of them. Closer to home for Rome might be Romulus, the founder of Rome, who is deified after mysteriously disappearing after a senatorial meeting. Whether they kill him or not is also debated. But manifests as the god Quirinus. So there is a long history of this. But there are also slightly more recent examples that might be found in the Hellenistic East, by which I mean, by the way, things towards from Egypt, from modern Greece, Turkey, and indeed further east from there. And that might be found, for example, in the example of Alexander the Great, who went to, we are told, in the ancient sources, an oracle in Egypt, and received quite a pleasing oracle for him, that he was actually the son of a god. This is the oracle of Ammon-Ra, who is associated or identified with Zeus. So he conveniently is now the son of Zeus. Very nice, can justify all of his conquests. And this appears on coins. The iconographic symbol of now the combined god, Zeus Ammon. You might be able to just see he's got a horn curling behind his ear in his hair. That's the horns of Zeus Ammon. Quite useful to be able to claim that you're the son of a god, and perhaps that you might become a god yourself. Alexander's successors, they're known as the Diadochi, continue a lot of this. It's very, very useful for him. It's useful for them as well. Continue to maintain and build these ideas of connections between themselves and deities, some going further than the others. The Ptolemies in Egypt, for example, carry on the tradition of the pharaohs, god kings. Demetrius Poliorcetes, who receives the wonderful surname the Besieger, which can sort of tell you pretty much what he gets up to quite a lot during his career, was once welcomed in Athens with a hymn which proclaimed him to be the son of the god Poseidon and the goddess Aphrodite. But even better than the remote Olympians, he was right there then. They could see him, he could help them, he could protect them. Similar divine honours are also found for some famous Romans in the Hellenistic East. A famous Roman general, Titus Quinctius Flamininus, who saved the Greeks, so he says, from Philip V of Macedon in 198 BCE, made a grand proclamation of, "The Greeks are now free!" Quite what he meant by that and what they understood by that is not necessarily the same thing. But what's interesting is that following that, he gets called a savior, and he receives dedications in the city of Chalcis, along with Hercules and Apollo. And a Greek biographer, Plutarch, who is writing in 2nd century CE, so more than 3 centuries later, closer to 4 centuries later, in fact, says that there is still a priest to Flamininus in that city to that day. So it's got a long legacy. And that's the environment that the imperial cult moves into. Augustus still plays it safe for a little bit, at least in Rome. Moving along my sort of chronology of coins here, he focuses more initially, at least in the city of Rome, of being the son of a god. Now it's Divus Julius, the deified Julius Caesar, definitely deified by this point, which he proclaims on an awful lot of coins. He's there depicted putting a star on top of a figure, which is probably the statue of Divus Julius in his temple in the Roman Forum. But it goes even further. Considering the fact that the Hellenistic kings had this background, it gets a lot more explicit in the Hellenistic East. And what we have here on this final coin in 19 or 18 BC, minted in Pergamene, is a temple, hexta-style temple, which you might just be able to read on the architrave, Rome et Augustus. A temple that was dedicated to Roma, the deification of the city of Rome, and the Emperor Augustus by the community of Asia. So that's sort of the background. The question is now, what does it really mean? Is this imposed? Is this invited? There's history, but that doesn't necessarily mean it always follows suit. If we were to follow a somewhat traditional narrative of top-down power dynamics, we might expect that the imperial cult slots in this and it is enforced by the emperor. To be imposed upon the communities of the Hellenistic East as a requirement for the emperor's continued good favor to them, or at least not open enmity. The dominant power, Rome, the emperor, enforcing the worship as a very explicit statement of the power differential between them, the ruler and the ruled. This doesn't actually seem to be the case, however, in the Hellenistic East. There's much more complicated power, political and religious dynamics at play. I'm not going to be so naive as to suggest that there wasn't any political maneuvering going on, that nobody thought it's probably a good idea to boost the emperor. We might get some favors from him later on. But I'm not so sure that's the only thing that's going on. If we did expect to see the imperial cult imposed, we might expect to see more uniformity. It's actually got quite a lot of local variances. There's quite a lot of changes depending on exactly where we are. So I give you 2 examples of passages from ancient texts here that might suggest some of those negotiations and how they worked to set out some of these power dynamics. The first example, short and sweet, is from Cassius Dio, talking about the Emperor Augustus, who is giving permission upon the request of certain cities that he may permit them to worship him. Very kindly, he grants that permission. But he adds a caveat, not in Cassius Dio, actually in another source, Suetonius, just to be humble not just me. You've also got to worship the goddess Roma. In the second session, we're moved on from Augustus's reign to that of his successor, Tiberius, and he gives a lot more detail. We actually here got a competition going on. So they have no longer decided amongst themselves that it's Pergamene who gets to do this. It's Nicomedia who gets to have the imperial cult, the center. There's only supposed to be one in every region. It's called the neokoros. There's actually a competition held before the Senate where a lot of different communities come together and make a claim for why they should have it. This is something they actively, or at least are depicted as actively wanting. We've got a variety of reasons here. Past aid given to the Romans, past alliances, some genealogical connections from Ilium, Troy, that through Aeneas, who was the founder of the Roman people. Well, we're practically family. We should have the cult of his descendant. I also love the very practical element offered by the Pergamenes that they haven't had an earthquake for 1,200 years, so your cult will be safe with us, which is wonderfully pragmatic, and I love it. It doesn't work out for them, unfortunately. It's actually Smyrna, mentioned at the very end, who claimed the victory. And the reason they do is actually also quite interesting. It's not for what they do now, it's for what they had done in the past. Tacitus goes on to tell the story of how they had helped a Roman army that would have otherwise perished. The ancestors' loyalty to Rome and aid guaranteed the prestige for their descendants. Not all requests were granted, however. This is a letter from Tiberius to a different community, Githyan in Laconia, so Sparta, that they actually inscribed, despite him saying no, but they still inscribed it, in which he responds that it's okay for you to worship Augustus, my father. He is actually a god at this point. I'll stick with more moderate honors. But I do love the last bit. My mother will give her own response. They've also offered to worship his mother, and he's not touching that one. She can decide. So what does this tell us about the different relationships at play in the Hellenistic East between Rome and the Hellenistic East, but also within the Hellenistic East? Well, we've got different levels of communication going on. I think we've got vertical and reciprocal communication between the Hellenistic East and the emperor. It's not being imposed upon them, but it's a series that's being created through negotiations and communications. He says yes to some places and no to others. It also shows a degree of horizontal communication between different communities in the area. This is something that we can boast about. We won that competition. We got the neokoros of Tiberius. This is great for us. At even more macro level, it's also internal communication within that city. If you as a politician could get to be a priest of the imperial cult, that might be a route to greater religious and political power for yourself. And I think that's where I want to sort of focus, is it's not just politics, it's also religion. We shouldn't, I think, ignore the possibility of actual belief. I'm not going to say there's no politics, but I don't think that should throw religion out. It's not just a political game of one-upmanship and power and trying to build a connection with the emperor to get something out of him later. There's much more going on here. Perhaps the Roman emperors were seen to be like gods in their level of power. They were able to aid or punish, help or hinder pretty much at a whim. Some places might never actually get to see the emperor, but they could still feel his might. Others might believe he was a full god. Perhaps on a different level of a spectrum, not quite up to the Olympians, the Zeuses, the Jupiters, but nevertheless, still very powerful. For my own research, I believe that we don't need to say that something has to be entirely political or entirely religious. They don't negate each other. And what's quite clear, from the imperial cult at least, is that it's a very complicated system of negotiations, of communications, not only between politics and religion, but also between different areas of the ancient world. And I'll end it there.
Thank you very much, Amber Gartrell. At the very end there, you asked us to think about the possibility that it wasn't just politics, that they were sincere, and it was possibly religion involved as well. What happens to all of this world, this system of belief, after the rise of Christianity? Is it wiped out very quickly?
It's not necessarily completely wiped out. There are still, in fact, legacies, elements. You can still visit something like the Sebasteum, which is the temple of the imperial cult in Aphrodisias. It probably takes on a sort of similar ideas get brought up, though, although now we've translated from being son of gods to obviously the son of God. Constantine, for example, does borrow quite a lot of the ideas from the imperial cult when he's proclaiming to have been chosen. It's just by a different god. So in terms of relationships, perhaps less biology suggested to be connected, but the idea of someone having a greater connection with the gods or God is still there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.